but we agreed about most things relevant to the debate around reason and faith and science and religion. Modulo a few things, a few positive things I would want to put in place of the sort that you just referenced. I mean, an objective construal of morality and value, right and wrong and good and evil, and also a contemplative life. I mean, I used spirituality in scare quotes in my book, Waking Up, trying to revive that term. I think that was pretty quixotic. I don't tend to use the term spirituality myself anymore. But what I meant to say is that there's clearly an understanding of the furthest reaches of human well-being that we can arrive at ultimately, whether we have it in hand now, that is deeper than culture, that's not parochial, it's not merely a matter of anyone's invention, but it actually speaks to some universal truths about the possibilities of human consciousness and even beyond, conscious machines if we ever build them, etc. So all of that relates, I think we're going to talk about the moral landscape, all of that relates to questions of value as I construe them and how a completed science of the mind could ultimately understand them. Right, well, so this is a kind of a funny way of hand-waving toward my argument that I refer to in the book and elsewhere as the worst possible misery for everyone, right? I think you have to grant, the only thing you have to grant really for my argument for objective moral truths to get off the ground is that a universe in which every conscious being suffered as much as it possibly could for as long as it could, that universe would be bad. That would be worse than other states of possible universe. Worse by any measure of worse that makes sense. And the moment you move away from the worst possible misery for everyone, things get better, however incrementally, and better by any construal of that word that makes sense. And if you're not going to grant that the worst possible misery for everyone, I mean, it's worth lingering on what those words mean. I mean, it's the worst. It's not. It's absolute. There's nothing possible that's worse than this, as far as the character of conscious experience, and it's for everyone, right? So there's no story that you can tell yourself about how we all get redeemed after this, or we learn a lot of good things that we can only learn this way. There's no silver lining. So this is a perfect hell insofar as that's possible. If you're not going to grant that that's bad, then I don't know what you could conceivably mean by the word bad. I mean, there's no application of that term that makes any sense to me. So if and whether or not you want to judge it as good or bad, whether you want to even entertain those thoughts, if you found yourself in that state, given given what it is to have a mind, and given what it is to have a conscious experience of anything, you will be disposed to move away from the truly intolerable and pointless misery that you've been granted towards anything else that's better, and everything else will be better, right? So it'll be analogous to taking your hand off a hot stove. So the simplest way for a human being in their kitchen to immediately get to the extremity of this is just, put your hand on a hot stove, or just imagine doing so and realize how untenable all of your hair splitting will seem. There's no place to stand with your hand on a hot stove as a human being and say, well, maybe this isn't bad, or maybe I have a preference for this, or maybe this is this is just subjective. Maybe this is just my own personal bias, which suggests that this is bad, right? Well, it's bad in any way that things could be bad. So there's the hot stove is one version of that. I mean, that is for creatures such as ourselves, that is a physical torture, right? And if, I would imagine that even if you had a masochist of some sort, if you just made it hot enough, it would cross into a threshold where, that would be nobody's preference. But there are other things that cause minds like our own to suffer. And so they could be ideas, it could be the knowledge that your kids are, being tortured in the same way in the next room, right? And so there's more to suffering than just extreme sensation. I mean, one thing I should add, I think you're probably headed here anyway, is that there are two senses of the dichotomy subjective and objective that we should tease apart, right? There's the ontological one and the epistemological one. And I guess I'll start with the epistemological. The epistemological one is the one that does differentiate between science and non-science, right? So if you're going to be epistemologically objective, that is to say your epistemology relates to how we know things or think we know things. to be objective in that space is to be dispassionate, not ruled by bias and confirmation bias or otherwise. To be to use all of the techniques that we learn in science and reasoning generally to not fool yourself, or not be fooled by others, right? So that your beliefs can more reliably track truth. So without personal bias, or from my saying that this claim is not merely a matter of personal bias, is to say that it's not epistemologically merely subjective, right? And yet the ontological split between subjective and objective is not doesn't cut across the science non-science divide. My argument is that we can be scientific, rigorous, honest, that is epistemologically objective with respect to subjective facts. Some facts are subjective and some are objective, right? So it's an objective truth about me that my neurotransmitters are in whatever state. It's a subjective truth about me that my experience has a certain qualitative character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many people imagine, and even many scientists imagine, that we can't, it's very difficult to make objective claims about subjective experience. But that's just clearly not true. I mean, we can make an endless number of clearly objective claims about subjective experience, even the subjective experience that we really can't know directly. I mean, the example, I give endless examples here, but we can objectively say that, in his last hour of life, Winston Churchill was not thinking consciously about how much he wishes he could get, Taylor Swift tickets, right? Or he wasn't thinking about string theory, or he was. I mean, there's an infinite number of things we know he was not thinking, yeah. And so those are objective claims about his subjectivity. Well, so I think if you push the analogy further, I probably don't have a problem with it. So I would acknowledge that there's a boundary, that the boundary between what we might call aesthetics and what we're always tempted to call morality or ethics when things become more important. I think that's fuzzy, and if aesthetic differences were, if you just turned up the dial of their importance, right? So if the difference between, and we can stick with color, I think it's less visceral for people than taste, but yes, I mean, let's just say that there was a certain color you could see that the pleasure of seeing it was so extraordinary that it just became one of the most important parts of any person's life to just get more of that color, around them, right? And let's say the color was, somehow resource constrained, right? So that, only rich people could get access to it, say. And let's say certain kids were born with a neurological deficit that didn't allow them to appreciate this color, but there was a surgery for that, or drugs they could take for that. Mm-hmm. The moment you dial up the happiness factor with respect to seeing this color, the more it edges into moral and ethical terrain. Whereas, if you deprive someone of this color, well, then you really this is a kind of crime against them, right? And we'd want to send you to prison, right? So, I mean, it sounds very far-fetched, but this is analogous to, you can imagine a color so rewarding that it would be the obverse of essentially putting your hand on a hot stove.
Suffering, it would just become pleasure. In that case, I think that we stop talking in analogy, and we're no longer talking about color as an analogy for pleasure. We're just talking about color as balanced on top of pleasure. We sort of just push the analogy until we're just talking about pleasure again. Mm-hmm.